these sorts of views are, I suppose, render me unfit to be a medical practitioner, and that I had to be suspended in the public interest is the way they put it.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Ray. Welcome to the Caldron Pool Show. I have a very special guest with me today, Dr. Jereth. He is an Australian medical practitioner. He's been a doctor over here for 15 years, and he has a shocking story to tell, which is exactly why I wanted him to come on today, not only to hear his story, but to hear his expertise. Jereth was sadly suspended from practicing medicine a couple of years ago, all because of social media posts, not because of a complaint from a patient, not because of any medical negligence that anybody can point to, but purely because of his thoughts and opinions online. So thank you for joining me today, Dr. Jereth.
Hi, it's great to be with you, Evelyn.
Now, you have a story to tell. I sort of briefly went into it, but man, I was reading some of the things that you've spoken about what's happened to you, the discrimination you've suffered, and I'm appalled. As an Australian citizen, I'm reading this going, I can't believe this is happening in my own country. So I wanted to have you on. I wanted to hear your side of the story. And for people who might not be familiar with you, can you sort of talk us through what led to you being suspended as a doctor over here?
What led to me being suspended? Okay, it's a long story, but I'll try to keep it short. I was working in general practice over the last 10 years or so prior to my suspension. So I'd been a doctor in total about 15 years, and then moved into general practice, and that's where I was. And what happened was that over a couple of years, two people who I don't know who they are. Their identities have been kept secret, but they're not people I've ever met. Made a couple of complaints to AHPRA. So AHPRA is the governing body of health professionals, saying that they'd taken notice of things that I've written online, such as Facebook, and they take an exception to things that they regarded as politically incorrect and so on, which then led to an AHPRA investigation. They hired their own private investigators to trawl through years and years and years of online content. They dug up things from as far back as 2010, so we're talking 12 years ago now. They dug things up from Bill Muehlenberg's blog. Bill Muehlenberg's he's a blogger, a Christian commentator. He's located here in Melbourne with me, and I know him personally as well. So I'd back in the sort of I suppose this was probably the pre-Facebook era, when everyone had blogs instead of using things like Twitter and Facebook. So I used to. Back in the day, I was a reader of his blog, and I would every now and again, I'd join in the discussions and comments there, and I'd have my say on a few things. And we're talking things like moral topics like abortion, gay marriage. So this is back in sort of 2010, that sort of time when gay marriage wasn't legalised and it was being debated, and so we'd get into all that. And they found all of that material. These private investigators dug up 2,000 pages of stuff, and a lot of it was from Bill Muehlenberg's blog. So I imagine some poor AHPRA person had to sit there and read through 2,000 pages of Bill's blog, getting triggered by all sorts of conservative opinions and whatnot. And anyway, but so they sort of extracted comments I'd made from there. Things about these sorts of topics, same-sex marriage and the morality of sexuality and abortion, euthanasia, and they essentially said that having expressed these views out there on Bill's blog, on my own Facebook page, as well as in an Eternity News article, which I wrote a few years back, these sorts of views are I suppose, render me unfit to be a medical practitioner, and that I had to be suspended in the public interest is the way they put it. Wow. So that suspension happened 2019 now, so we're almost sort of 3 years ago, and I've been sitting here essentially waiting for the matter to be resolved. The way they suspended me was through, I guess, emergency powers. So these are powers that exist for AHPRA to deal with a doctor or nurse or whatever who's perceived to be a serious risk, a danger, to remove them immediately before any kind of thorough investigation or thorough trial, just to make sure that they're keeping people safe from someone who's dangerous. That's what they're designed for. So if you've got a doctor who's practicing very dangerously or risky or is incompetent, they can be removed instantly, and then sort of shoot first, ask questions later, and the investigation can happen later. So that's what they did, and I'm waiting now, and I've been waiting for 2.5, going on 3 years, for that actual process of investigation to reach some kind of resolution. And I know it's going to reach a resolution. Well, I understand it's going to happen this year. There's going to be some a trial in a court, essentially, a tribunal, and that's it in a nutshell. I think, as far as I'm aware, while it's taken this length of time for anything to happen, that's not because they've been actively doing anything. That's just because that's the nature of bureaucracy. Things just get put on a shelf, and they get left there, and they get busy with other things, and then eventually they remember that my file is there, and we'll get round to dealing with it now.
That must have been pretty hard for you and your family. I'm guessing you're a family man. Since you've been suspended, is that suspended without pay? Like, what's sort of that? Are you without income whilst you're sort of waiting for this inquiry?
So I'm not allowed to call myself a doctor or practice as a doctor or medical practitioner. So I'm not allowed to do any kind of medical work. It's very, very broad. I can go get a job, stacking shelves or whatever else if I want to, but I'm not allowed to work in any kind of medical field which requires a medical qualification. So look, that was what I was trained for many years and experienced in and built up all the skills in, and I had a practice. I had a few hundred patients who were my regular sort of patients who relied on me, and then all of a sudden I couldn't look after them anymore. And it was definitely hard on us because it meant a sudden, my income was suddenly cut off. And it's not a sort of situation where your boss fires you, well, you go find another job with another employer. I couldn't go to any employer to be employed because I wasn't allowed to practice anywhere in Australia. So it leaves you with no options. So it was hard on us as a family, having the income suddenly cut off. We were a single income family. But, I also, the thing that really makes me personally most angry is the effect it had on my patients, because I looked after all these patients, and, the way that patients come to rely on their doctor who's known them for many, many years, and they've confided in you, and their whole story, their whole background, every medication they're taking, and every surgery they've ever had, and you've got this intimate knowledge, and they want to be able to see you whenever they need help or a new prescription or whatever, and people find it hard to, a lot of doctors, I think, feel guilty even about taking annual leave, right? Even taking 2 weeks off, because it means, my patients won't be able to contact me. There's this real sense of duty towards these people, and Even taking 2 weeks off can be really, really hard for some patients who are extremely dependent on you. And so, for me, it's not I'm taking 2 weeks off. It's suddenly being removed altogether, and without any sort of explanation to them, without any forewarning. So it came literally out of the blue. I was told on a Friday afternoon that you're going to be suspended, and then by the next Thursday I was suspended, in 4 business days. And so there was no opportunity to wrap things up, hand things over, explain to patients what was going on. It was just a sudden disappearance, and a lot of them had no idea where I'd gone. All of them had no idea where I'd gone. They weren't, able to be given any kind of sensible explanation. And I think that, I know that was very hard for many, many of them.
What was the transition like, Jereth? Like when you were suspended, what actually happens to those patients? Is there sort of a shift of responsibility or onus on those hundreds of patients that you were serving? Because basically the Australian Medical Board have removed you. Do they then have to take responsibility for organising treatment and care of those patients that were under you?
No. That's not something that they assume responsibility for. Now, I was very, very fortunate in that I worked in a group practice. So I worked with, a dozen other doctors, which meant that all of the copious notes that I'd written and on file for all those patients were in a computer system, which the other doctors could access, and that sort of would have helped the other doctors to, they would have had to sort of wade through pages and pages of notes to sort of get their heads around these patients, but at least they were able to do that, I suppose. There are some more recent instances of AHPRA suspending doctors who were solo practitioners.
That'd be
that
difficult.
Makes it very, very hard, because then these people, they can't just rock up to the clinic that they're used to going to. They have to find another clinic and then somehow have medical notes transferred across, and that would be a real nightmare. But fortunately, in my case, it meant, we can see another doctor at the clinic. That doctor has access to the notes that Jereth's written and the history, and that, so there is...
It assisted a bit, yeah.
There is some sort of continuity there, but that's, that's through circumstances. That's not because the AHPRA system takes any kind of responsibility for the ongoing care of these patients. That's just, that's up to my clinic and the patients themselves to make arrangements.
Now, at the beginning, you sort of mentioned that there were 2 people who were anonymous to you who, I guess, made these complaints. Now, are you on social media publicly as a doctor, like on your Facebook page, or when you wrote the piece for Eternity News or on Bill Muhlenberg's thing? Did you stipulate in those things that you were a practicing doctor, et cetera, or were you just Jereth, the human being, like the rest of us, giving your opinion on something?
My Facebook page has always been a personal page, so it doesn't list my title as a doctor. It doesn't list any credentials. It doesn't list any sort of qualifications or anything like that. And I don't speak there as a doctor. I don't give medical advice. It's a personal page that I use like everyone else does. I share photos of things that I've seen, that I've taken and whatnot. It's entirely personal. Likewise, when I've interacted on Bill Muhlenberg's blog, for instance, that's personal as well. That's not with some kind of title or qualifications after my name. So the exception is the Eternity News article. So about 2015, which is when the Bruce/Caitlyn Jenner thing happened, and the whole transgender topic exploded in the world. I wrote an article. It was actually a response to somebody else that I wrote, and it was giving a perspective as a Christian and as a someone with a personal background in medical practice on this topic of somebody changing gender from Bruce to Caitlyn. And in that article, I was identified there. I'm a medical practitioner. I have medical experience, and I know a few things about giving hormones and so on. So that, I think that was different. That was, I wasn't speaking for the profession. I wasn't speaking on behalf of the entire medical profession, giving an official point of view. I was still speaking as an individual, but it was in a sense wearing a doctor's hat. But yeah, look, the personal stuff on Facebook, that's just all personal. None of that is in any kind of professional capacity at all.
So, in a nutshell, you as a human being gave your opinion, and in one particular piece gave your expert opinion, and one could deem you as an expert more than myself because you have the qualifications, you have the lived experience, the worked experience. So you as a person expressed your opinion on something and was suspended from practicing medicine because of it. Have I got that right? That's basically it in a nutshell.
Yeah, look, I'm aware that after that Eternity News article got published, I'm aware that because that was sort of fairly public, I suppose, unlike my Facebook page, which is really only looked at by my friends, that article, being in eternity, gets more circulation. So I'm aware that I was sort of targeted by activists after that, and a couple of people took notice and sort of decided that they wanted to take me down. I didn't know this at the time, but I've sort of since learnt that that's what happened. And I suppose that these anonymous activists then started to they found me on Facebook and started to monitor things I was saying there. And some things there I share privately, most things I share probably privately, but then a few things I share publicly, especially when I'm just sharing an article or something like that. And over a couple of years, they were able to accumulate enough material about my opinions on things like transgenderism to say, well, this is someone who's spouting politically incorrect views and so on, and they were able to decided to try and get me through the AHPRA system. So they made the complaint. That's what I assume happened.
Can you sort of explain to me and to people who might be listening what your views are on that gender subject? Because obviously people are accusing you of something. I'd love to hear what it is that you actually said.
Yeah, look, you mentioned, I guess you said I was offering an expert opinion. I mean, you could say that in a sense, but you don't have to be an expert to know human biology. You just need high school biology to know that there are things, there are chromosomes, and male and female, we're born with one set of chromosomes or the other in the vast majority of cases, and that determines whether we end up male or female, and that's part of our reproductive system and reproductive capacity, and it's hardwired. This is the sort of thing that I've sort of been defending, against the ideology that says it's fluid and we can just pick whatever we want to be and change our pronouns and name overnight. So yeah, look, it's simply these common sense things which everybody believed up until 5 years ago, that if you're born a boy, then you're a boy. If you're born a girl, you're a girl. It's something that you just observe by looking at a baby. As soon as they're born, they're, in the vast majority of cases, they're a boy or they're a girl, and you name them accordingly and raise them accordingly. And when they grow up, that's how everything functions. And it's not really controversial. You don't have to be a medical professional to understand the difference between a boy and a girl, and the fact that you can't change from one to the other, and the fact that there aren't 53 other genders. There are actually only two when it comes to reality. So it's expressing my points of view about these matters, and particularly as a Christian, whilst it is biological reality, as from a Christian point of view, it's very clear cut in Scripture and in the account of how God creates us, that we are male and female, and that these are categories which have been defined by our Creator, and they're not the sort of thing that we determine ourselves and that we can chop and change as we wish, and that, you know, blurring these distinctions between the sexes, the genders, is something that is regarded as sinful in the Bible. So it's essentially that's the kind of thing that that's gotten me into this trouble. And the one of the main allegations that they have made, that AHPRA have made, is that I am contradicting the accepted medical consensus or the accepted practice of the profession, which is that you can change people from one gender to the other. And in saying that you can't, I'm contradicting that and undermining the wider view of the profession. I suppose that's what they're going to argue.
So in Australia, I know in Ireland, when late-term abortions came in, there was a big sort of upset because the ability for a medical practitioner or a nurse, etc., was basically stripped away from them. They had no choice because abortions were now made available in a public health system like a hospital. And so there was a lot of Christian doctors and nurses who said that's unfair because, you know, as a Christian, I can't perform an abortion. And I'd like to have the choice as a doctor or nurse whether I do that or not. Is it similar in Australia, or is it, as a doctor, you have to do basically what you said? If somebody wants to transition, you have to do it. Or is there things in place for you as an individual doctor to say, no, I don't want to do that, and then you can maybe refer them on to a different doctor? Like, how does that process work over here?
Yeah, look, that's a very good question, Evelyn. I would have to be honest and say that it isn't entirely clear what the answer to that question is. So on the one hand, if you look at the medical practitioner's code of conduct, there is a clause in there which says that you can be a conscientious objector. So if there's some kind of procedure that you are uncomfortable with and that you have a moral or philosophical objection to, you don't have to participate in it. So, for instance, thinking back before all of this gender stuff, there might have been some doctors from particular Christian traditions, Roman Catholicism, for instance, who would object to things like IVF, artificial reproductive technologies, such as IVF, and even in some cases contraception. Certain Christian traditions regard that as impermissible. So if you were a strict Roman Catholic doctor, these conscientious objection clauses supposedly exist to give you a way out of having to do those sorts of procedures, and you won't suffer, in theory, you won't suffer any kind of professional repercussions for saying, I don't do IVF, I don't prescribe contraception. So those clauses exist, but on the other hand, we seem to be moving into a territory where even expressing objections to these things gets you in trouble. So, if you were to read these conscientious objection clauses, well, it should say that as a doctor, I don't have to help somebody transition their gender. I don't have to prescribe them hormones to become, to pretend to become the other sex. But that could then open you up to a complaint, and that could then lead to, allegations that you've been discriminatory or something like that. And it really isn't clear. I was fortunate that I never in practice faced a direct request from someone about changing gender. So I never had somebody come to me and ask me to send them on to have their gender changed. But having said that, other doctors have, even some of my colleagues have, some of the people I work with at my clinic. So in fact, there was one instance where one of the doctors at my clinic told us the story of parents who brought in their young child who, I think we're talking about a child who's 4 or 5 or 6 or so, very, very young, just starting school, wanting to be the opposite gender and being given that request from the parents to send them to the local gender clinic. And she was faced with that. So it's something that does happen. I was fortunate never to have faced that personally. I mean, if I kept practicing, then probably sooner or later it would have happened, and then you'd be faced with this dilemma of, well, how do I manage this? Now, on paper, it might seem that you couldn't politely decline and say, this is not something that I agree with, or this is something that's against my principles. I don't think it's a good idea, and I don't think it's medically a good idea either. You'll have to speak to another doctor about it, and that could include just booking with one of the other doctors who works here. In theory, that would be how it might work, but in practice, you can imagine it could lead to a complaint. We've been discriminated against, we've been judged, we've been, made to feel, this doctor has made us feel that we are of less worth or something like that. That could then, that would go to AHPRA. They could then investigate you. And you could end up in some kind of trouble for that. And certainly, if I can get in trouble just for saying on Facebook that people shouldn't have these treatments, so-called treatments, and that people shouldn't, there's no such thing as changing from one sex to the other, then surely if you're in some real life situation where that request is put to you and you decline, you would think that would get you in trouble. So
yeah,
I hope
there's
that
been I was going to say there's been a huge increase over the last few years of gender transition.
Oh yeah.
Like growing up in the 90s, for me, like I don't know anybody who transitioned gender, but I know I have relatives who are in high school, family members who I know of who are in high school, and they know at least 1 or 2 kids in their year who are currently going through transition. And that blows my mind because, as I said, it's just something that I'm not used to. Now, I'm not sure whether you can comment on this. I'm not sure whether this is in your expertise or you have an opinion. It's up to you. But can you kind of maybe shed some light into why you think there's all of a sudden an increase in kids, particularly who are wanting to go through a gender transition? Do you believe that there is some form of medical negligence because doctors are incapable of maybe looking at the core reason why that's happening, and they feel like they just have to do what they're being asked to do because they might lose their job?
Oh yeah, look, what your experience I think is a very common one. I share that experience, and so do many people. So I've heard numerous stories from people that I know saying, my granddaughter is now wanting to transition into a boy, and so on and so forth. Or my friend has a child in their class who, so it's really all around us, and statistically we know that just by looking at the media and the statistics, that there's been, in some cases, I think in the UK, a 4,000% increase in this sort of thing happening on previous years. So there has been an explosion. There's no disputing that. Why that's happening, there have been people there have been experts who've addressed this question. And one that comes to mind that I'm aware of is a American. She's a physician, I think, and a public health expert. Her name is Lisa Littman. She has looked specifically into this question of why, among adolescents, and I think particularly adolescent girls, why there is this phenomenon of so many of them suddenly declaring and deciding that they're boys. And she's she's done some research into it. It got her fired from her job ultimately, but so she calls it a social contagion, and that's a word that is now being, I guess, quite widely used. It's a contagion. It's a something that, so it's a social phenomenon. It's a peer group pressure type thing, like getting tattoos and experimenting with drugs and all those other things, which are sort of peer group influence. When you have others in your peer group doing something, there's that tendency, I suppose, and it seems to be more so in females to sort of copycat that behaviour. Certainly, when you look at anorexia, there is, it's a documented thing that there are groups online and social media sort of networks of girls with anorexia, and they kind of effectively encourage each other in that behaviour. And the same sort of thing seems to be happening here. There is a, I don't know what you want to call it, a herd effect or a peer pressure effect, where females in particular are more vulnerable to it in that adolescent age group, where they sort of follow along with what others are doing. And then when you have someone famous like Ellen Page, who's now called herself Elliot Page, when someone famous like that does it, it becomes even more trendy. And so it's a sociological phenomenon. I guess the question from a medical perspective is, do we go along with it or not? Do we say, well, we're not going to be part of this because it's not helpful? Or do we say, all right, come along, we'll prescribe you the hormones, we'll give you the mastectomies and whatnot, and we'll give you what you want? That's the question for the medical profession. And unfortunately, it seems to be going that way. It seems to be, at the very least, it's facilitating it. It's saying, okay, well, if you are a girl who's decided that you don't want to be a girl anymore, we'll put you on puberty blockers, we'll give you male hormones, we'll do a mastectomy on you, all those sorts of things. When really there's no medical justification for any of it, and it's demonstrably harmful. So,
well, that's what I sort of wanted to ask you. Going back to the peer pressure, social type influences, I don't know if you remember a TV series on Netflix called 13 Reasons Why, and it was about a young girl who was in high school who committed suicide, and she recorded 13 tapes to 13 different people in her school year as to the reasons why she committed suicide. And they almost glorified suicide. They made it attractive because this girl and her story. And shortly after this particular series was released, they saw a number of suicides in teenage girls increase, or at least, not necessarily, they weren't successful with the suicide, but it was attempted, or they had those thoughts. There was a significant increase. And there was actually, and I forget the person who did the study, but there was a study done particularly around that TV series and the effect that it was having on young girls, and how it was this social identity sort of thing. And so I can see the parallels with that age group, with women, and it actually just breaks my heart. Like I genuinely get sad for young girls and boys who feel that they don't have an identity unless they do certain things to their body.
And the media is aware of this. The media knows that when you report on suicide, it can trigger people out there to start thinking about it and want to do it. So that's why they do, as a general rule, they try to minimise their reporting on suicide as much as possible. And when they do report on it, they put a lifeline or Beyond Blue sort of notice there. Because they know that some people are suggestible. When you put an idea in their head, they'll go and do it.
What's interesting as well, sorry, just cut you. It's
No,
interesting
that's
as well. The if you look up the statistics, there's actually like an LGBT website, and you can get it straight from their website. So it's not from some alt-right news site. It's not from, it's actually from their own sources, and it goes through mental health for people in that particular group in society. It goes through lesbians, it goes through non-binary, it goes through transgender, it goes through gay, goes through all of them, and it gives you the individual statistics for increase in mental disorders, depression, suicide, and
alcoholism,
successful
and all those sorts of things.
And it's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And all I keep thinking is, surely there's another answer for all of this. Surely, and there's also a lot of other studies out there that I've read that show that there's a lot of transition regret, especially in adults, and if kids are transitioning when they're young, by the time they reach 25, I think it's over 70 or 80% of people that eventually have feelings or thoughts of regret. And the whole situation just breaks my heart. And what breaks my heart even more is we can't have these honest conversations so we can genuinely actually help people who need help. And I guess that must be frustrating for you as a doctor, to be in a position where you're not allowed to consider alternative ways to help people. You just have to do what they're asking, or you have fear of losing your job. So I honestly, I don't know how you guys do it. I'm not a doctor, and I struggle on the sidelines looking in to this sort of world. But I wanted to ask you about the Australian Medical Board. Is it AHPRA? I think you mentioned. Who is that made up of? Are they actual doctors or are they business people? I'm just curious who's overseeing doctors overseeing doctors, or civilians?
Look, it's a very, very murky system. AHPRA is an umbrella organisation. So AHPRA is over doctors, nurses, paramedics, physiotherapists, optometrists, dentists, so all health practitioners. And so under AHPRA, you have the medical board, the nursing board, the physiotherapy board, and so on. So it's one great big monstrous bureaucracy in Canberra and in each of the states. And, you can sort of, to an extent, go on the website and see who's part of these organisations. But, like all bureaucracies, there's a whole lot of people there who are faceless, and there's no way of finding out who they are, and particularly the ones that make decisions. They're faceless members of the bureaucracy, and obviously in the medical board there are some doctors there, and in the nursing board there's some nurses there, but then there are also bureaucrats and all sorts of other people. And sometimes I wonder if the kind of person searching through my Facebook and selecting out incriminating comments is some sort of 28-year-old arts graduate who
no experience in medicine.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah. Sometimes I wonder that. So it's a very murky world, and when AHPRA was formed a few years ago, well, maybe 10 years ago now, as an amalgamation of all these different boards and agencies, there was a lot of opposition from people saying that we're creating this monstrous bureaucracy that's answerable to nobody, and that's before that it was much more local and state based. Each state had its own board, and you didn't have this one entity that managed all the health practitioners of every sort. So It's a great mystery.
Yeah. So when AHPRA essentially suspended you, what was the response from your colleagues that you worked with? Were they in shock? Were they sad to see you go? Was it confusing to them?
Probably. I mean, because of the nature of what, because one day I'm allowed to go into work and then one day I'm not, then in a lot of cases, I spoke to a few of them. And the ones that I spoke to were sort of shocked and horrified and upset. But, after a while, I sort of gradually lost touch with them because I wasn't going to work anymore, wasn't allowed to go to work. So, and I suppose they just had to move on. And and part of the whole thing is that when something like this happens, it's all very secretive. So they don't, they don't really sort of know why it's happened, other than what I've told them. It's not published anywhere. So, I guess they've got to reserve a bit of judgment as well about, we've got to wait and see how this whole thing plays out before we know who's the guilty party and who's the innocent party. And, 3 years later, we're still waiting for that to play out. But yeah, look, obviously the people I work with and the people that I knew well and knew me well, they were all aware of the fact that it was nothing to do with my patient care or my clinical competency or anything like that. It was all stuff that happened outside in my personal life. It was
because you've never had a complaint from a patient. This is literally this has happened. This entire suspension has not been because a patient has complained that you discriminate against them or you didn't give them good medical treatment. This is purely anonymous people online who have found you and targeted you.
Yeah, in my case, yes, that's right. So I've never, thankfully, never had a patient complaint made to AHPRA about competence or anything like that, or rudeness, or so it was all sort of it was all outside of work, and I think that's what's really quite troubling about this whole thing, is that it's showing that there is no longer this clear demarcation between your professional life and your home life or your personal life, that the professional bodies and employers and so on can now intrude on what you do at home, wearing your pajamas, and they can hold you accountable for those things and fire you and discipline you and so forth, even when you're not at work. They feel they've got this complete ownership over you. The same thing happened with Israel Folau, the rugby player. The things he got in trouble with were not on field. They had nothing to do with his teammates. They had nothing to do with any of the referees or anything to do with the game. It was something he said on his personal, page or whatever. But they now believe that they have ownership of you in that sort of 24/7 way. Where what you do and say, even at home, in the middle of the night when you're not at work, falls under their jurisdiction, so to speak. So,
just doesn't make sense. If someone had have complained against you, even then, it's an allegation only, and it needs to be proven. But that makes a little bit more sense. But the fact that no one has complained about you, and you as a doctor, it's honestly shocking. And I remember reading somewhere that you shared maybe something from One Nation, from Mark Latham possibly, and that came up in the investigation. And all I thought was, he's an elected politician in Australia, an elected one. He's represents our political parties over here, and you're not even allowed to share some of his content. I know you shared some things from the Daily Wire and some other conservative sites, and these are all things, am I right, that came up in this investigation?
Yeah, they've come up. Yep. So there's stuff a whole lot of stuff which I've shared, and often without even adding any of my own comment. Things from the sorts of places you mentioned: Mark Latham, Matt Walsh, Ali Stuckey, and websites like Public Discourse and the Gospel Coalition, and even the Australian Christian Lobby and Lyle Shelton, sharing their blog articles and so on. It's all been captured in the net, and because it's about topics like sexuality, gender, gender identity and transitioning of gender and so forth, they've captured all that and said, you can't say those things, you can't share those things. Those are things that it's against against the I guess the rules of the not that these rules are really stipulated anywhere, but
But You've also mentioned before that you're not the only doctor in Australia who's been through this, and I know, I'm guessing through your experience, you've probably learnt a lot of other doctors that have been through something similar. Can you share like a couple of, obviously without giving out details because of any legal course or anything, but can you sort of share some other examples of similar things?
Yeah, well, look, in the past, there's certainly been a number of other doctors who've gotten in various kinds of trouble with AHPRA over things similar to me. So speaking about abortion, speaking about gay marriage. One doctor I'm aware of gave a speech or talk in a church about safe schools. And, he was saying that, safe schools is a bad idea and it's bad for, corrupting children and so on. So, and that came to someone reported that to AHPRA, and he got AHPRA knocking on his door about that. So there's been that kind of thing in the past, and other doctors have had AHPRA come after them for opposing transgender so-called treatments. I'm probably, as far as I know, I'm the only one who's gotten to the point of being suspended. Oh, actually, no, that's not until there haven't been many who've been suspended for those reasons, but more recently there've been a whole lot of doctors who've been suspended over COVID-related. So in the last couple of years, excuse me, with COVID and all of that, there've been a number of other doctors who've been suspended in the same way that I have. Instantly removed from practice without any kind of trial. So look, some of those are very, very publicly known. So you have Mark Hobart, Paul Oosterhuis, I don't know how you pronounce his name, but that's my best guess. Robert Brennan. So you have a few of these doctors who, and in some cases, all they have done, like me, is write things or say things which are deemed to be against the accepted orthodoxy. And it's been nothing. In some cases, it's been to do with what they've done at work, but in many cases, it hasn't been. And they've been suspended because they have, allegedly contradicted the government policies with respect to COVID. So, look, they're in a similar situation to me now. They're waiting trial, I suppose, unable to work. And it's pretty horrible, especially when you consider that none of them have actually harmed a patient. That, as far as I know, we're talking about the sorts of things that don't actually harm individual patients. They just go against, an orthodoxy that's been defined by politicians, essentially.
Well, it's probably a good segue. I actually wanted to ask you about COVID, if you're happy to sort of talk about it. As a doctor, I mean, firstly, as a citizen of Australia, I've been appalled at the handling of this pandemic, from the censorship, from the lack of objective debate, from the lack of science, from the lack of common sense. And particularly, you're hearing horror stories, like you mentioned, of doctors who dare to talk about preventative treatments, who dare talk about the efficacy of the vaccines, and who dare want to give exemptions for people who might have medical reasons, or they just want to wait. And so I'm shocked as a doctor. How have you sort of interpreted, or how have you seen the handling of this pandemic? Are you as shocked as me with it all?
Oh, look, I kind of feel now like I dodged a bullet. So I got suspended in, second half of 2019 before all this hit, and I sort of feel like, gosh, so I didn't have to practice medicine through the pandemic, which now I think that really spared me from a whole lot of
God's
grief.
grace.
Now, look, definitely. I live in Melbourne. We've been through 262 days of hard lockdown. Can't leave our homes for more than 3 reasons, for more than 1 hour a day. You can't go more than 5Ks from home, and we've had to endure that for those 2 years. It was horrendous. And the harm that caused on so many levels to so many people, including people known personally to me, Obviously this whole COVID situation is very, very complicated, but I think what you can see happening is governments rushing to declare states of emergency and then giving themselves extraordinary powers to rule by decree, basically, and enforce martial law, which has completely decimated all our all our civil liberties and so forth. So look, we've had to live through this whole nightmare of and it's been particularly bad in Melbourne with protesters being pepper sprayed and shot at with rubber bullets and all that sort of thing. It's been horrendous. Now, from a medical perspective, well, it's a coronavirus is a medical condition, but the response to it is a government thing. It's a political thing. It's a policy thing. So it's enforcing a curfew at 8 p.m. isn't a medical thing. It's a political thing. In fact, here in Victoria, it was admitted by the government that advice to have a curfew at 8 p.m. did not come from the chief health officer. That was just a decision by the premier and the government. These sorts of rules. You can only travel 5 kilometres from your home. You can only leave your home for three or four reasons, and things like vaccine mandates. These are all political policies, political decisions. They're not medical in nature. Medical things are, it's about prescribing medication and so forth, and some sort of an arbitrary thing like 5 kilometres is the limit you can travel. That's not medical,
Do you feel like doctors have had their hands tied throughout this pandemic in terms of what medicine and treatment they can give their patients when they're fronted with coronavirus? And not only that, other medical sorts of treatments. Like there's a lot of telephone appointments now as opposed to face-to-face. What sort of impact is this having on actual people who are practicing medicine?
I know that look, it's had an impact. We all know that things like elective surgery has been suspended for a long time and shut down, and lots of consultations have been cancelled, and things are being done remotely or not at all. A lot of screening programs have been affected by this. So it's happened not just here in Australia, but in America and everywhere else, where we've become so focused on one virus and one condition that we've basically decided to ignore everything else. All the other healthcare problems, and including mental health. We used to talk about. We used to pride ourselves on how seriously we took mental health, and mental health is just as important as physical health. And all of a sudden, that whole priority has changed. Mental health is completely being thrown under the bus. We don't care that these lockdowns have increased depression, increased alcoholism and addictions, and we've just kind of accepted it all as collateral damage. That there's increased suicide thoughts in children, and that there's families breaking apart, increased domestic violence, and all those sorts of things. We just, that's just collateral damage because we only care about one condition now. The only disease that matters is the coronavirus. Not all, there's no balancing of priorities. There's no seeing things as parts of a whole. There's just this tunnel vision about one thing, which has led to everything else being completely ignored for 2 years, and that's going to come back to bite. So people who have had all sorts of other where their health has suffered, physical and mental, in all sorts of other ways throughout these last 2 years, that's not going to suddenly magically disappear. That's all going to come back to bite eventually. With more chronic illness and more mental health problems, and it's going to be years to sort all this out.
Yeah, I feel like there's going to be a lot of underlying health things that people have put off because of the pandemic. I mean, breast screening clinics were shut for a time, and that's such an essential service. It's such a necessity, preventative measure of health. That's only one example. There, as you mentioned, there is mental health, which is, I think, going to be a ginormous thing that we're going to have to experience in the future. I think a lot of children at the age where their cognitive abilities aren't there and they're developing and they're learning, and this is the world they've been thrust upon. I don't even know, and I don't want to pretend to know I fully understand what it's going to be like in the future for them, but it's scary when you think about the ripple effect that putting all these other things off is going to have. I mean, alcohol in Australia, there's 431, and it's probably more now. That was a statistic from a few years ago, that are admitted to hospital every day for alcohol-related diseases. We don't hear about that. We don't get those numbers on the news. No. And, it does seem exactly as you said, very much tunnel vision. And would you say that this is going to lead to like mass medical negligence on a huge scale across the country?
What do you mean?
As in, sorry, that was probably a bit of a broad question. The policies and the handling of the pandemic, do you think that that's in the end going to result in a lot of long-term medical problems? Do you think that the government might be hard for you to say?
Will they own up to it? I don't know. I mean, I don't hold out a lot of hope that anyone's going to be held accountable for any of this, but who knows? I think it's going to take probably a decade for the dust to settle, and maybe in 10 years' time, when people look back, they'll be able to say, that wasn't handled very well. The problem is there were so many people at the time saying, no, this is not the right way to do it. There's been the Great Barrington Declaration and all those sorts of things. There have been so many experts saying, no, we're doing this, going about this the wrong way, but they've been ignored. And look,
why
maybe
is that?
I don't. Well,
why are some doctors being listened to and some not? I mean, I spoke to Dr. Peter McCullough, the leading cardiologist and epidemiologist in the world, the most published doctor when it comes to COVID, and he's being censored. His opinion isn't allowed to be said. He has spoken about the efficacy of vaccines, and again, censorship. Why are some doctors being heard more than others?
I wish I knew. Look, I think all of this that's happening, and it links to what's happened to me, is that what it appears to me is that there is this effort or project to impose a strict orthodoxy on all of healthcare and medicine, where it's very, very fundamentalist. There is a right and a wrong. You are either, it's truth and error. It's religious almost. Look, when it comes to medicine, there are right ways to do things and wrong ways to do things. If someone's having an asthma attack or a heart attack, well, there are right ways to treat that, and there are wrong ways to treat that. But we're talking here, we're not talking those sorts of things. We're talking areas where there is legitimate uncertainty. So when it comes to what you do with someone who's confused about their gender, you're fooling yourself to think that that's clear cut, and that it's obvious. We just help them change their gender. It's just rubbish. That's just a political bandwagon. It's ideology driving that. There's no, the evidence base for that is extremely poor. In fact, the evidence speaks against it. So, and yet they're imposing a new fundamentalist orthodoxy. You have to believe in it. If you don't, you're a heretic and we'll excommunicate you. And I think it's the same thing with the same sort of process that you can see playing out with some of this COVID stuff. There's one way to think. Everyone's got to sort of march in lockstep with that. And that one way to think is, you've got to be pro lockdown, you've got to be mandating the vaccine to everybody, including children and whatnot. And if anyone sort of deviates from that, then they're a heretic, and there's no room to have a debate. There's no room to have a discussion. There's no room to actually sit down and look at the facts together. It's just black and white. You're either on the right side or the wrong side. If you're on the wrong side, we remove you. I think that's what seems to be happening, and it's this sort of dogmatism. And the thing about COVID, it's only been around for 2 years, right? It's brand new. 2 years is a blink of an eye in history. There are many things in medicine which have taken decades to sort out to get the right answer. An example that I like to sort of mention is giving oxygen to people who've had heart attacks. For going back almost a century, the practice was, if someone's having a heart attack and the ambulance turns up, to give them oxygen, because the reasoning was, their heart is being starved of oxygen, so we put an oxygen mask on their face and give them more oxygen and it will help their heart. And they did that, for decades and decades and decades. And then finally, about 10 years ago, they decided, well, let's actually look into this. Let's do some robust study into this issue. And they found that the patients being given oxygen were ending up with worse outcomes, that it was causing damage. And it caused this total reversal of decades and decades and decades of practice. And so now, if you are having a heart attack and the ambulance comes and they'll check your oxygen levels, if your oxygen level's normal, they won't give you oxygen. And there's been so many examples of this sort of flip-flopping in medicine over years. More information comes to light, and the way we used to do that wasn't so good. And it will change back and forth. Hormone replacement therapy for menopause is another example where there's that being going back and forth. And some of my older colleagues who practiced medicine for longer than I had would talk about how in their career they've seen so many things flip between, we do, this is now how we do it. Now this is how we do it. Now this is how we do it, because it's just continually, there's a process of discovery. It's also complicated. And so where am I going with this? COVID's been around for 2 years, which is the blink of an eye. And there is this, you can only describe it as this overconfidence, this absolute certainty that this is the way we deal with it. We have to do it this way. And if you even sort of dare to suggest a different way of doing it, then we purge you. And it's just ridiculous. I mean, we all saw with our own eyes that at the start of 2020, they were saying, no, don't wear masks. Masks are not useful. They're not, they don't prevent. And that has been long-standing sort of advice, even from influenza in the past, that, masks aren't very helpful in preventing the spread of these sorts of viruses. But then almost overnight, you've all got to wear a mask all the time, everywhere. That changing in position, and then now finally, they've quietly sort of backed down from a lot of that now, and now there's some data that's finally emerged that says, actually they're not so useful. So to have this sort of absolute certainty, it's almost like religious certainty that this is what the scriptures say, so we believe it. And if you don't, then we purge you. It's just ridiculous for something that's only been around 2 years, where everyone is grappling to work out, what is going on and how do we deal with this. And so, look, maybe it'll turn out that some of these doctors are right, some of these doctors are wrong. But the point is, we can't even have the discussion at the moment. Only one point of view is allowed to be expressed. The authorized orthodoxy, and when that's happening, you don't have any confidence that we're going to arrive at the truth. That's how I see it anyway.
I have a friend of mine who was mandated for the vaccine, and he has a family history of heart problems and everything else. So he's gone to the doctor and just said, look, I'm young, like I'm in that young category of men who is got a higher chance of having complications if I get the vaccine. Can I just have a 6-month exemption to wait for more data to come out? Not that they're anti-vax, not that they're never going to do it, but just some time, just a period of grace where they can figure out what they're actually putting into their body. And the doctor, based on the medical history of this patient and the family history, said, I want to give you an exemption. I think that you would be one of the people who I would happily give an exemption to, but I'm not allowed to. I'm so sorry. And this doctor said, I can verbally say to you, don't get it, because I don't think that you should, but I can't put that on paper for you. And my friend is like left going, oh my goodness. Like,
well, it's, there's a doctor in Victoria. He used to practice down sort of Rosebud Way, elderly doctor. He gave advice to a patient along similar lines, a young patient who, came to ask, and someone who's young, who's not at very high risk of the virus at all, and said, what should I do? And he didn't, as far as I know, write any kind of exemption. He just said, look, I think it would be reasonable to wait until, he didn't say, don't get the vaccine, it's dangerous. He said, it's reasonable to wait till there's more data about safety. And then that somehow someone in that patient's family or whatever reported that doctor to AHPRA, and he's suspended now,
Wow.
And there's a number of instances where that sort of thing has happened. So it's, you don't have to be a raving anti-vaxxer and talking about it, having microchips and 5G. You just have to say, oh, look, I'm just not so sure about this. And here's the thing, talking about flip-flopping, as recently as 6-7 months ago, in about May of, what year are we now?
2022.
May of 2021, you had Anthony Fauci and the head of the CDC was saying that this vaccine, if you have it, you cannot transmit the virus. It leads, it's a dead end. And they were even saying in America, once you've been fully vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask anymore because you can't transmit the virus. And that was the head of the CDC and Tony Fauci himself saying that in about May of 2021. Now, where has that advice gone? Within about 2 or 3 months of that whole thing was, they had to completely backflip on that and say, well, actually, no, it doesn't prevent transmission. You've got to put your mask back on. And then, and then Omicron comes along and completely blows the whole thing out of the water. So, So this idea of that, well, there's only one way to think about it and you've got to toe that line. And it's been shown over and over again to be flawed. And the thing about the vaccines, anyone who wants one, by all means, go get one. But people who have hesitations, those hesitations should be taken seriously. There shouldn't be this compulsion. People shouldn't be robbed of their ability to work, over this sort of thing, because the fact is this is a very new product. It's only been around for 1 year. We don't have the complete data. That's why they are not, they're provisionally licensed or EUA, emergency use. That very fact says, well, we don't have the full data. And if someone wants to wait for that full data before they make a decision, well, they should be allowed to, especially if they're young, at relatively low risk. I know another doctor who got in trouble with AHPRA, because she had a pregnant woman ask her for an exemption. And, I think it's fair enough if you're pregnant to go, oh, how might this thing affect my unborn baby? So this doctor wrote an exemption for this pregnant lady. And then I don't know if it was that lady's employer or whatever sent it into AHPRA, and then now she's in trouble. So
it's insanity.
It's a complete intolerance of, it's completely unreasonable. We've gone from medicine being something where we give recommendations and we give advice to being the old school model, the old model of medicine that we're supposed to have rejected now is the authoritative model where the doctor gives the orders and you submit to that. You don't ask questions, you just do it because the doctor said so. And when I went through training in the late 90s or whatever, they said, no, we don't do that anymore. Medicine's about a partnership with the patient. It's about gaining their trust and that therapeutic partnership where they trust you, where you give them advice and information, and they go away and make their decision. If you prescribe them something and they decide not to take it, well, that's life. You can't force them to do it. But we've reverted back to this authoritarianism. I mean, look, most doctors probably aren't that keen on it, but it's what the government is requiring now. The government's saying, it's the government more than doctors saying, take the medicine. If you don't take it, you can't work, you can't go to a restaurant, you can't get your hair cut, you're excluded from society. And it kind of doesn't matter what people's reasons are. Because there's all sorts of complicated reasons why someone might not want to have something. I know elderly people who don't want the vaccine. And it's probably, I'd have to say, for an elderly person, it's probably in their interest to have the vaccine because they're more vulnerable, but they don't want to for whatever reason. But that's their choice, isn't it? I mean, it's not for the government to say you have to, because the government wouldn't do that with anything else. They wouldn't force them to take their blood pressure medications or their cholesterol medications, but now it's saying, well, we can force you to take this. It's just a complete upending of the way everything's been done for so long. And you just wonder, well, is this temporary, or is this just how things are going to be from now on? Is this going to be, are we reverting back to a model where you follow the doctor's orders without questions, or you follow the government's orders mediated through the doctors?
It's quite scary when you think about the precedent that this is setting. It sounds like you broke the precedent, and modern medicine has been more of a relationship between doctor and patient. And as you said, it sounds like we're reverting back to that authoritarian type doctor-patient relationship. And that's not a good thought. And I'm sort of at the point now where even if you are an anti-vaxxer, so to say, good for you, because at this point in time, I think that people are forgetting the big picture. People are forgetting the precedent, because you might think it's justifiable to force somebody to be vaccinated now because of what's going on. But now, once that precedent is set, who knows, in 10, 15, 20 years' time, your kids could be faced with that precedent or something else that you don't agree with. And, I don't like the word anti-vaxxer. I don't like the negative connotation it has, and it's like been turned into a dirty word, and I just reject it altogether. There are so many things I'm rejecting. I reject the idea that I have to publicly display my private medical information. I think that's a really bad precedent that we've set. Family and friends, you have to say, just letting you know before we catch up, I'm unvaccinated. I don't know what you want to do. I don't know if you want to see me, but I don't like it.
Would you like to know when I had my last pap smear as well, and my last colonoscopy?
Exactly. Here's my blood type. Here's an ultrasound of my uterus, so you know I am a woman. It's just it's just ridiculous what's happening. The story that you mentioned about the doctor with the pregnant woman. I mean, goodness, you don't eat ham, cold meat. You don't have Panadol, Nurofen. You don't do anything when you're pregnant. You treat yourself like this sacred vessel that's growing in human life.
Very much, that's exactly right. It is. It's a sacrosanct status. Something that something that's drummed into you when you're learning to be a doctor, when you're training you, is find out if that woman is pregnant, because if she's pregnant, you can't prescribe her anything.
Anything.
It really restricts what you can prescribe them, because everything is potentially dangerous. They can have Panadol, and that's about it.
Even breastfeeding mothers. You've got to be careful.
And they can't have their cold meat, they can't have sushi. There's this extreme level of caution about pregnant women. But now a woman is this lady is hesitant and concerned about the effect it might have, and seeks an exemption, and the doctor gets in trouble with AHPRA for writing an exemption. It's just insane. It with anti-vaxxers. There are principles at play. There are more important principles that are underlying all this than simply, can we control the virus or not? I've always been someone who's in favour of vaccines and very happy with the measles vaccine and the chickenpox vaccine and the tetanus vaccine and all those other vaccines. They're all, all very good, and I used to encourage them and encourage my patients to have them. But something I've also respected is that people have a choice and that people can decide not to. And I'm not going to twist somebody's arm if they say, well, no, I don't want my kids to have this, or I don't want to have this. I'm not going to force them to, because I think that choice is very, very important. If we violate that principle of choice, then we're going down a very bad road as a medical profession. There has to be that consent, and that's considered important some of the time. So, if a surgeon went ahead and, while we've got your tummy cut open and we're doing this procedure, while I'm here, I might snip this other thing too, just while I'm here, they can't do that. If you haven't got the consent from the patient to do that, you can't do it. You have to have the consent, unless it's an emergency. You have to have the consent from them before they've gone under to do whatever operation you're going to do. And doctors would get in a lot of trouble in the past for doing things without the patient's, without a proper informed signed consent. But now that there is no consent anymore, you can't consent to something when it's, you have to do this or you will lose your job. There is no consent. So there's that complete violation of that important, crucial principle. And you can be pro-vaccine, that's fine, but to take that step and say, we force it on people, that's wrong, absolutely wrong, because you don't know what you're opening up, what Pandora's box you're opening up when you do that. There's been a long, in the disability community, there's been a very long running historical issue of disabled people being given contraceptives without their consent, and that kind of thing, being sterilised without their consent. I mean, it used to be a practice that if someone was disabled, we'll snip their tubes or whatever, make sure they don't reproduce because they won't be able to handle it. And disability advocates for a long time have fought against that. And they fought successfully against that. So those sorts of practices are now considered wrong, because you can't do things to people without their consent. And just the fact that they're disabled doesn't give you an excuse to think, well, I know better and I can kind of do things to their body that they haven't agreed to. Well, all of that's now suddenly reversed, and we are back to forcing people to do things that they don't want. It's just terrible. How long will it? Where could it lead? Could it lead to, well, if you don't take a contraceptive, then you're going to lose some privileges. I don't think
where it went in China.
Yeah,
with abortion, the one child policy.
Yeah.
That's the rabbit hole. The rabbit holes go long and far, and they are dark and scary places.
Exactly. Yeah. And you can't just assume that because we live in a Western country, things are going to stay rosy, because all of the freedom we enjoy is extremely fragile. And
very true.
Once we say, well, the government now owns my body, the government and government doctors can decide what gets put into it and what happens to it, that opens up some very dangerous paths. So
it does. Yeah, but look, what I want to know now is where's your story ending? Like, you're obviously being suspended. I know. Yeah. Wouldn't you love to know? I would love to know where things end. I'm somebody who, when I get a book and people are going to listen and cringe, but I read like the last chapter just so I know where it's ending. I just can't handle the suspense. So I'd love to know the ending. But what I mean is, you've been suspended from practicing medicine. You're obviously going through a process right now. Whereabouts are you up to with that sort of stage?
Well, I'd love to know the end of of this too. And as I said earlier, it does appear to be heading towards some kind of, hearing and trial this year. So I think something's going to happen this year. Look, and something I want to say is that this is something that I think, I would like people to take seriously, because it isn't just about me and one person and one person's career. It's a bit like Peter Ritt, the academic who got fired from his university because he said the wrong things about the Great Barrier Reef. These sorts of decisions that get made by courts end up impacting everyone. In Australia, we have a common law system which we inherited from England, and in common law, the way it works is that when a court makes some kind of ruling, that then becomes set in the book. Yeah, that's right, and that then will determine every other ruling in the future about anything that's related, and that's how common law works, and it's generally a good thing. But so if you have someone who is being tried for saying on Facebook that a man can't change into a woman, and he lost his job for that, and he lost his ability to practice for that, then and there's a ruling that says yes, that was fair enough, and he ought to be punished for that, then that becomes part of the body of law. And anytime that will empower activists to be able to attack anyone in the future if they decide that they don't like what you think and what you say, and they can find some evidence that you've got the wrong opinions about transgenderism or abortion or whatever. They'll be able to take action against you, and because a decision's now being made in the law books that you can't say those things, those sorts of things are discriminatory or offensive or antisocial or whatever. They're going to rule the same way. So whatever outcome happens to me, I'd like to know the end of the story. I'd like to see it resolved one way or another. But it won't just affect me. In a sense now, this has gone on for long enough that I've really stopped caring, in a sense, about, well, will I work again as a doctor? I mean, I've been taken out for 3 years now. I'd have to start all over again if I went back. But, that's sort of not the issue now. The issue is, well, what ruling will be made? And that ruling is going to be there as a precedent for everything else that happens in the future, not just for doctors and nurses and healthcare providers, but, they can refer to that in any kind of future litigation against someone who's, been accused of transphobia or whatever. And it's not just, saying something at work, or it's not just something that, happens during office hours. It's when you're at home, outside of your work time, on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. No longer at work, but but they can still be monitoring you, and there can be repercussions. So I think that's that's why I hope that people will take this seriously, because it is going to affect everybody in the long run, or it's going to have wide-ranging effects in the long run.
Yeah, and I'm actually genuinely sad that you're not practicing, because you're the sort of doctor I would want to visit, someone who does care about my whole health, someone who isn't caught up in, the political, authoritarianism, but someone who's actually a doctor who will treat me as an individual patient and hear my needs and work with me. So I'm sad that doctors like you are facing positions like this. I genuinely am going to pray and hope that everything comes out how it should. And as you said, case law, a scary precedent. It can be a very good thing, but it can be a very bad thing, because, as you mentioned, judges, magistrates, they can use that when determining their sentencing, their rulings and all that. So, hoping and praying that the right outcome will come from all of this. I do hope you stay in touch. I'd love to sort of catch up with you again later down the track and see, I guess, what happens and what happens as a result of that trial. But I really appreciate your time today. I really appreciate your insights and for being so bold to speaking out about this, because it's almost an impossible thing for doctors to do today. So thanks so much for joining me.
Please keep praying for all the other doctors who are caught up in all of this, and the ones who've been stopped from practicing, but also the ones that are still practicing and are caught in that very difficult situation. And I know, I've been connected to networks of them, secret networks of hundreds of doctors who are flying below the radar. They think in a similar way to the way that we think, that they don't believe the government has the right to do all these things, but they are doing their best to keep looking after their patients, within the tight sort of restrictions that are surrounding them. So, please pray for them. A lot of them are Christians.
Yeah.
Many of them, not all of them are, but many of them are. So, it's a difficult world out there. And in some ways I'm glad that I'm being spared from all this.
You're benched for the moment.
That's right. I get to sit this one out.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for your time, Jereth. It's
no
been
worries.
a pleasure, and definitely
likewise.
be praying for you and your family and everybody else.
Thanks. Appreciate that. Good to talk.